I have the pleasure to open this next focus zone panel on the topic of human trafficking and cities with our three panelists here present in person and Valiant Richey present virtually. Now I also see you, Valiant. Welcome here with us. So let me just briefly say a few words about the topic, very few words actually, then I will introduce the panelists and then we will start. So human trafficking is a concept which probably is familiar from the media to all of you. It is probably less familiar to all of you what specific complexities are linked to human trafficking, and particularly also how the fact that very different types of levels and of actors are involved makes dealing with the phenomenon of human trafficking a particular challenge. And why do we have this add up cities in the title? Well, because very often the victims suffering from human trafficking are coming from cities, and equally often, at least even more, I would say, their destinations are in cities. So cities are particularly affected from human trafficking. Being aware of the fact that there are borders between cities, and the borders are not the borders of the cities, but they are the borders of countries. And then we do have international organizations, like, for example, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, also being affected and trying to cope with these challenges. So the objective of the panel is twofold. We first would like to outline with somewhat more details and precision that I have just done it, the complexities of this phenomenon. And for this, we will take advantage not only of the relatively high number of the panelists, but also of their complementarity and diversity in the way they are looking due to their organizational, professional position towards this issue. And in a second step, as we don't want to leave this room too depressive, we also would like to look at the possible ways forward in trying to mitigate at least some of the aspects linked to human trafficking. So having said this, let me first introduce our virtual participant, Valiant Richey, who is the OSCE Special Representative and Coordinator for combating trafficking in human beings. Welcome, Valiant. Then let me introduce Sonja Roest, sitting to my right. She is responsible for cross-cutting issues of domestic and sexual violence, prostitution, human trafficking, victim assistance and threat management with the Department of Justice and Security of Basel City. Welcome, Sonja. To her right, Simon Geissbühler. Simon Geissbühler is a Swiss diplomat, an ambassador, and head of the Peace and Human Rights Division of the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs. Welcome, Simon. And finally, Faduma Abukar Mursal. She's a senior lecturer and researcher with the University of Lucerne, and she's particularly conducting research on the militarization and securitization of urban spaces, political violence, and moral economies. And about what that all means, we will hear more in a couple of minutes. So welcome, all of you. And as time is tight, I'll first hand over the floor to Valiant to give us a brief introduction into this complexity from his side. Please, Valiant, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Mr. Moderator, and it's a real pleasure to be with you all today. And I think it's a really critical topic right now. Being the special representative for the world's largest regional security organization, I spend a lot of time talking about the scale of trafficking at the regional or at the global level, the different forms of trafficking, the number of victims, the online markets, the global conventions or policy frameworks to tackle it, and so on. For example, we know from research that there are some 27 million victims of sexual and labor exploitation globally, and that number is increasing. Or that the human trafficking generates $100 billion a year or $150 billion a year in profits, more than the Apple Corporation. But ultimately, human trafficking is about people. It's about human beings being harmed by the horrible behavior of other humans. And this harm manifests at the local level, in our communities and in our cities. And people are recruited and exploited at the local level, in bars or clubs, in construction sites, in farms, even in public offices, like for cleaning services, behind closed doors in domestic works, or in the streets for forced begging. So although much of our focus is on the role of the international community and national governments, if the problem manifests at the local level, this tells us our response must also be local. Local authorities are often the first to come into contact with both victims and traffickers, as you just said. And most victim services are provided at the local level, for example, shelter or accommodation. So if cities are a critical actor in the global response to exploitation, how do we empower them? How can we help them be more and more effective in combating and preventing the crime? How do we factor their role into the national and international policy making on these topics? I think these are important questions. So a couple thoughts. First, there's a need for targeted capacity building directed to the local level. Not only training on how to refer or identify victims, but also building the capacity of institutions and coordinating bodies. If your local authorities are going to be doing most of the anti-trafficking work, we actually have to empower them to do a good job. Second, we really need to understand the human trafficking landscape at the local level. You combat trafficking more effectively when you know where the risks are and where they could appear. So similarly, mapping of populations at risks, whether it's migrants or refugees or vulnerable youth. Again, local authorities are often going to be in the best position to identify these issues, which takes me to the last point, which is on strategies. Yes, local authorities have to have a prominent place in national and regional strategies against human trafficking, but they should also have local strategies and action plans. Those local strategies can set a standard for international or national action. This is where innovative, multi-agency, multi-sector cooperation can help. Agencies across local governments or NGOs or the private sector can all come together. The reason for this is that we are increasingly, over the last 20 years, I think, understanding human trafficking not as a criminal justice only problem, but a society-based problem that requires a society-based response. So before I was the OSCE special representative, I led a coalition at the local level for law enforcement, NGOs, policymakers, the private sector, and service providers focusing on commercial sexual exploitation and trafficking. We worked across sectors, including, as I said, civil society, private sector, public sector, to be more effective. That experience established a model that can be replicated in other communities and highlighted for me the power of local engagement and action. So although trafficking is as widespread and profitable as ever, I think we see some solutions here in bringing together local coalitions to help have more impact beyond our old approach of combating trafficking. Cities are the front line for this, and I think they are going to help us turn the tide in this fight. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Valiant. So you addressed the local level a couple of times. I think for us it perfectly fits the foreseen chronology on the panel. And I'll hand over to Sonja.
Thank you very much. Of course, it's very important to empower the local communities and to focus on the local level, but we're in Switzerland, so the local response is normally over-focused. So I would tend to say that we need more responsibility on the national level. I mean, the complexity I can really tell. I'm on the cantonal level. I'm head of the roundtable on human trafficking. Alone in our really small city canton, we have only 3 communities. I have 50 members at the round table. And that's not the only committee. We have steering committees, we have working groups, we have task force, we have on every level we need this exchange, because all the contracts and law is very nice and everything is set for a long time already, but you have to break it down into practice, and you have to really keep it going, because people forget when you have this cooperation agreements and everything is written down, but if you don't keep all these representatives of the different authorities and of the different departments on an ongoing process, they just forget about it. And we have so many examples for this. For example, we already have a victim and it's in a shelter. Then we have an agreement with the social welfare authority that they take over the costs after 6 months. And then it happened that we didn't have this person at the round table, and so it ended up at a person who didn't know about the agreement. And then they said the victim, we spent so much money already, and it was really dangerous. Their suggestion was to send it to an ordinary sleeping shelter without any security. So then you have to see, okay, on which level do I have now my cooperation partner? I have to discuss with them, because that's not possible. So you have to keep doing this. And we are really, I think we do a really nice work at the operational level, but we have a lot of boundaries between the departments. And in Switzerland, I say we have a problem that the national level is not that strong, because it's only in the responsibility of the cantons to fight human trafficking. And that's kind of insane, because human trafficking is normally international, it's organized crime, and then you have the small cantons who have to fight against human trafficking. And of course, I mean, if I tell already that it's almost not manageable to be responsible for the communication and coordination in my little canton, how should it be on every other level if every canton is responsible themselves? So my wish would be to strengthen the national level, at least in Switzerland.
Thank you very much, Sonja. So it's as if we really would have prepared this panel fantastically, because the ball is just, handed over to the national level. Simon.
Thank you so much, Laurent, for the invitation and the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be back in beautiful Basel. I'm still struggling a bit with the difference in temperature between Khartoum and Basel. I was in Khartoum at the beginning of this week, and I mentioned my visit to Sudan because it made the link between conflict-related human trafficking in cities and the role of cities in countering human trafficking very visible to me. There are numerous refugee and IDP camps in Sudan, which have grown into fully fledged cities in the last few years. These cities have become hotbeds of human trafficking. Sexual violence is also widespread. I had a discussion with the ICRC delegate in Khartoum, and he told me that in a recent survey they made in such a camp city, it became clear that 9 out of 10 women in these camp cities were sexually abused or raped. So, how to deal with the protection of civilians in general and with human trafficking in particular in these more and more urbanized environments is a huge challenge. Now, let me state the obvious: human trafficking is a violation of human rights and a crime that thrives in the context of conflict and contributes to the destabilization of communities. As such, this topic is very much linked to the core mandate of the Peace and Human Rights Division I'm heading. In our division, we focus, among others, on the interlinkage between conflict, violent conflict, and forced migration. On the one hand, it's very clear that human trafficking is often a consequence of instability and conflict. Evidence shows that human trafficking is an increasing feature of modern conflict that is characterized by impunity, the breakdown of law and order, but also the breakdown of institutions, of trust between human beings, and of social networks. Particularly women and girls living within conflict zones or fleeing them, and I mentioned the example of Sudan, adopt negative coping mechanisms, for example, transactional sex or so-called survival sex, to gain access to basic goods, safety, and security. Others become victims of trafficking based on false promises for economic opportunities or, obviously, a more prosperous life elsewhere. And conflict usually also triggers large population movements that foster conditions within which trafficking flourishes. Lack of access to safe and legal migration options forces many persons fleeing conflict to use the services of so-called illegal facilitators to cross borders. Thereby, they increase their exposure to exploitation and trafficking. And even in the presence of legal pathways, human trafficking can flourish. An example is the Russian war against Ukraine that resulted in unprecedented movements of people, mainly women and children, spreading across Europe and overwhelming many immigration authorities. And that is obviously a fertile ground for traffickers, and I think we'll get back to that specific example a little bit later on. But on the other hand, I think that's important to underline, and Mr. Richey has also alluded to it, human trafficking fuels instability and conflict. The multi-billion business linked to trafficking is a significant income stream for terrorist organizations, armed groups, and international and transnational organized crimes that are responsible for destabilizing entire communities and nations. And dealing with trafficking should therefore be perceived and understood by peace-building practitioners as us and others and you here in the room as a key element of any meaningful effort to reduce fragility. And I would like to give you then in a second round some more concrete details and examples what we are concretely doing.
Thank you very much, Simon. And well, now moving slightly away from the immediate practice to research, but the research, as I understand, very solidly grounded in reality. Faduma, it's all yours.
Thank you so much for the presentation and for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be part of this important discussion. And so I'll jump right into it and maybe tie a bit all of the aspects that have been mentioned together. In order to account for the urban aspects of human trafficking, it requires us first to understand human trafficking as a particular kind of migration which intersects with urban criminality. And both migration and urban criminality are very central for cities on many grounds, but I'll focus on three interrelated dimensions. And so first, what makes a city? Different countries adopt different approaches to defining the city or the urban. Some use political or administrative boundaries. For others, cities are urban areas which share common characteristics, such as various kinds of infrastructures, or use population size or population density. But one emerging consensus is that urbanization is critically important, not least for the large proportion of population that it concerns. And given that cities account for large and growing proportion of the world's population, it's also not a surprise that many of those who embark upon or who have undergone migration journeys, including irregular ones, live in cities. And cities' attraction range from the availability of food and accommodation, the possibilities to earn, to store and receive funds, as well as various kinds of infrastructures, connectivity, and anonymity, which facilitates journeys to other cities, but also the proliferation of criminality. So in fact, our understanding of the impact of migration on cities has moved away from tracking routes because these, for obvious reasons, that they are constantly changing because of constantly changing law enforcement focus or migration policies. So moving away from tracking those routes, we consider growingly so-called hubs, which are also dynamic, but they're proved to be more constant over time. And these hubs are almost exclusively cities or larger towns. And not only do urban areas attract people, but they also grow because different types of migrants invest and inject their resources into local economies, increasing them in numbers as well as in dynamism, while local population and industries cater for people moving. And so the second aspect that I think is important to mention is that certain drivers of urban globalization, or global urbanization, have led to the growth of the human smuggling and human trafficking industries in the form of unlawful labor migration. So, yes, so forced migration have increased across the globe, have increased due to several factors, including the proliferation of irregular wars, the environmental disasters, as well as shrinking urban livelihoods, among many other factors. But simultaneously, the legal venues for migration, international migration especially, and for especially for people living developing countries, which are often unavailable, unaffordable, or administratively unpractical. And this triggers the need for services of intermediaries, and here that's also the dependency and the growing role of smugglers and traffickers. At the same time, cities' need for labor to sustain their growth also offer further opportunities for exploitative labor markets. And these impact formal and informal migrant workers, as well as criminal trafficking groups. And finally, the third important urban aspects that is worth mentioning concern the various linkages between marginalization in the allocation of resource allocation and service delivery on the one hand, and on the other, urban criminality. So as many smuggled migrants and refugees are unable to attain regular status upon arrival, they become stuck in a state of precarious irregularity and are unable to access cities' formal support structures. And they are therefore rendered extremely vulnerable to the exploitation by criminal groups in a range of informal businesses, which include the form of trafficking. And this typically impacts traditionally more marginalized communities, such as women, minorities, and youth disproportionately. And for these networks, humans become one of the several commodities that are trafficked into, through, and from the city for profit. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Faduma. I know I started with this clapping, but now we'll stop it, because otherwise we lose too much time. We'll do a big clapping at the end. And I was telling this to myself. Yeah? So, Valiant, getting back to you. You were mentioning the need for targeted capacity building at the local level. The local level said, thank you, but this may not be the ideal level. So bringing this back to you, I mean, you are the highest level present here in this panel, representing not a supranational, but at least an international organization. What do you say, or could you give us some hints in regard to this thematic in your organization, in the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe? Is it like a hot potato everyone is aware of, and let's let's say the locals are responsible because they are not directly represented in the organization, or how do you see this?
What a provocative question. Thank you. I think it depends on the local. What I mean by that is that I had the good fortune to conduct a country visit to Switzerland earlier in the fall of last year. And so I'm a bit familiar now with the cantonal structure of Switzerland, and I can understand Sonja's point that the cantonal framework puts a lot of sort of onus and responsibility on the cantons in Switzerland, and Switzerland could probably benefit from a more active national presence on this issue. That being said, there are a number of cantons in Switzerland that don't have roundtables and should have them. And so I think there's a responsibility sort of from both sides here to step up. But in other countries, there's a stronger national system, and the local structure is pretty weak. And they don't have the services at the local level. So, for example, in some countries, you see very strong services only in cities, only in the capital, but there is plenty of exploitation happening in the agricultural sector in more rural areas where there is just no services at all. Another example, and this is back to the capacity building point, is that I think that the international community needs to take the lead on broad policy frameworks like how to deal with the misuse of technology. We cannot expect cities to negotiate individually with online platforms about what those platforms should do to mitigate risk. The international community and national governments need to have those conversations. However, it is local investigators at the city level who will be following those cases on those platforms and need the capacity to actually understand what it means to identify a victim on a website or to look onto Facebook and see where recruitment is happening. And that's exactly what we're seeing with Ukraine right now, is a flood of efforts by suspicious characters in chat rooms where Ukrainians are going for accommodation and labor, and they're offering them suspicious opportunities in webcamming for high value money for very, very unclear circumstances, which raise the alarms for us. It won't be a ministry level. It won't be a parliament conducting that investigation. It will be a local anti-trafficking police force doing that. And so I think what we're talking about is not one or the other. We're talking about a whole of society moving it forward together.
Thank you very much, Valiant. Simon, between the international and the local, are you? I mean, as a member of the panel. And so what would you say or add?
No, thank you so much. Indeed, we try to link these levels, and let me give maybe 3 examples for exactly the questions you raised. At the Peace and Human Rights Division, we really try to link our work between policy and practice, but also then backwards practice to policy. 3 examples. We cooperate very closely with the Office of Mr. Richey at the OSCE to prevent and combat human trafficking in the context of the humanitarian crisis related to the Russian aggression against Ukraine. We support the OSCE to engage major destination countries of Ukrainian refugees to effectively prevent and respond to trafficking in persons. This is done through the development and implementation of policies and practical measures of frontline responders at the national level. And we, Switzerland, ourselves, we will benefit from such a capacity building workshop in March of this year. At the same time, the project aims at strengthening cross-border partnerships and cooperation, which is highly needed, because, again, the solution cannot be a solution for the city of Basel or for Moldova or for Poland. We have to work together, and we have to find the synergies, the partnerships, and the cooperation. Second example, and this is really an example on the city level. In a recently launched project, we support the Mixed Migration Center and UNODC to assess migration flows arriving from Ukraine to the cities of Bern, Berlin, and Warsaw. It is important to have adequate data so as to better understand the journeys of people fleeing conflict, the challenges they face in countries of transit and destination, and the resulting risks of being trafficked or smuggled. The findings will be made available to key stakeholders and policymakers and aim at improving respective policies and preventive measures. And the third example is from the city of Geneva. The example is an initiative that was launched in Geneva, obviously a hub of many international organizations. And the goal of this initiative is to prevent human trafficking in diplomatic households. How we are doing that? Upon arrival in Geneva, diplomatic staff receives an onboarding that informs them about their rights. Their contracts are checked to ensure decent working conditions, and they are introduced to an independent ombudsperson's office that offers legal and mediation support in case of alleged human rights abuses and other forms of disputes with their employers. So you can see we work on all these levels and try to interlink them also, because they are interlinked, and the cities play really a key role in what we try to achieve together with the OSCE and others.
Thank you very much, Simon. And well, it's actually very interesting that you, among the examples you highlighted, one is targeting particularly also peers in terms of your profession, and we are all aware that it is a not very safe space, which has been debated already many times. Sonja, Basel was now not mentioned, but Bern, I know there is this, it's very difficult from talking about these issues, seriously speaking. I mean, do you, the project, the way it was now very briefly described, because we don't have so much time on the panel, but do you think this is a good way forward? I mean, this exchange is also looking at concrete countries of origins and effects, comparing the effects in cities, selected cities of different countries to get more information?
Yes and no. I mean, there's nothing new. We know a lot already. And what we are really fighting most with is the lack of resources. Because what's my job? I'm kind of building bridges. I made the note from the last panel. It was interesting aspect of how many liters coffee had I been drinking to have these informal meetings to convince people to work together with us, to send their people into the training, to find allies, to convince our government, you know. And sometimes I have a bad conscience, because it's not so difficult to activate people. It's not so difficult to train them. It's not so difficult to make some really nice actions, right? But to keep it sustainable, because our system cannot digest too many victims, and that's terrible, because we make ourselves responsible. So we have a lot of well-trained people with, and we have nice experts, even here in Switzerland. We have now Stefan Fuchs from Trafficking. He was carrying out a study about Nigerian brotherhoods, and we invited him to give an input for our law enforcement authorities. And one of the prosecutor's office representatives, she was almost crying. She said, "Sonja, I love this training, but please don't, because I feel terrible. I know we won't be able to do anything." Right? So that's my problem. But still, I mean, it's important. It's important that we are doing studies. It's important to gather the information. You know, to realize Basel, yeah, it's really small, but we are at the 3-country corner, so we're really attractive for criminality, right? We have a bad reputation. We are the most criminal canton in Switzerland. And I can give you some really small example how this complexity is really kind of absurd. So we have, for example, we carry out controls because, I didn't really go into depth, but to find victims, you never find a victim who comes up to the law enforcement authorities and says, I'm a victim. So you have to go and look for them. That's why we need to train people. That's why we need all this cooperation process. So what do you need to do in the beginning of finding the hints and then maybe have a suspected victim? You carry out controls. And for example, we do it in our red light area. We use undercover investigators, and increasingly the sex workers, they look for customers in Basel, and then they meet at the border, and then they go over to Germany or France. So what are we doing? Our policemen say, bye-bye. Nice try. But here we are not under the criminal law, we are under the police law. And there the cooperation with Germany and France, which is centralized, we have to cooperate with Paris. That's not realistic. We don't have these resources. But at the same time, we were able to advocate to have the human trafficking as a priority in the governmental prioritizing in fighting crime, right? And since then we made so many progress. But the big question is if it's really so important for Switzerland, where are the resources? And if I have to work together with all the other departments, that we have another problem. The leadership. The understanding of leadership is normally in a hierarchy. Human trafficking is a cross-cutting issue. So you need to lead in a matrix. And nobody understands that, you know? So people are used to give orders or get orders, and then suddenly I'm coming up and they're like, you don't tell me what to do. And I say, yeah, so I try to drink coffee and convince people.
I'm laughing, but it's a tragic topic. So sometimes this is also a coping mechanism in addition to coffee. Faduma, when listening to this from your perspective as a researcher, and I know also having field experiences in slightly more remote countries, what do you say? What are your thoughts and your comments?
Well, when you ask me the question how to improve the situation for a researcher, I'm already, this is not my area of expertise. Yeah. But what I can say, I've worked done my field work in Mogadishu, but also in German prisons and German context, which also made me think of what could be the role of cities in addressing those issues, and might be not as practitioner-oriented or with much detail knowledge as you do, but from my experience, the way in which, or like I've said before, the way in which urban areas closely related to the phenomenon hints also towards the way in which they can take actions. And cities and urban areas, which I'm focusing on, have impacted and impact human trafficking industry on several grounds, and so they can play an important role in just addressing how to understand really, like you said before, you have a very good understanding of the phenomenon, how to understand and communicate risk and how to frame crisis. It's also, all of these areas have, there are a lot of a significant knowledge gap in different societies. And in fact, cities, it's not about creating not only new channels, but they're already involved in several of those challenges. And over the years, the increasing importance of cities have been recognized in international affairs, and often in reference to so-called global cities, which, although largely very defined in narrow economic terms, but of course, cities, like it was said before, are not, on the negotiating tables. They are also not signing treaties. But what is recognized is their role and their growing agency in shaping global governance across a range of policy areas. And that could also work for this human trafficking topic. And cities actually form networks, they engage in dialogue with their counterparts, they facilitate public diplomacy, they share best practices and encourage collaboration between international, private and public entities. We've seen that this morning. It was very beautiful exchange and of knowledge. And these channels and know-how is also very much of interest to national levels and have already been recognized on a global level. But also cities and municipal authorities are really well placed to communicate and cooperate with local actors who which include both civil societies, NGO actors who have direct connections to target groups and individuals. We've heard it before. Cities have also the privileged position to strengthening the resilience of communities who are vulnerable to human trafficking through outreach and prevention programs, but also to understand the human trafficking intersections with other forms of urban violence and urban criminality. And I think that Valiant started saying that it needs to be a society-based response, and it's also important to remember that cities are made of people, and I'm not talking about people drinking coffee to deal with the frustration, but I'm also meaning inhabitants, and so maybe the success of cities' objectives could rest on translating objectives into everyday practices. Anthropologists always talk about everyday practices, and so embedding those indicators of success into security practices and giving inhabitants responsibility through collaboration with local, national, and global actors, and using community-based activities to help strengthen social cohesion. But also, yes, one of the challenges, which is also very important to address, I think, and which has framed mostly the resistance to involving cities in these processes, that monitoring and evaluating of indicators carry the risks of becoming surveillance tools rather than developmental ones, both on the municipal level, on an individual or inhabitants level.
Valiant, Sonja, Simon, and Faduma, many thanks for having been with us on this issue. I think the way the inputs were made shows, in my opinion, the urgency, but also the difficulty to cope with human trafficking. It shows the relevance of cities, but it shows beyond the relevance of cities, the relevance of the international, the national, the urban, and the societal and individual level to cope with this. So even though it is a very tragic topic, it may also carry the potential to improve joint actions and cooperation with or without matrices to help move forward in a positive way. Thank you very much to all of you.